9, 12, 10, 28, 2, 23.
This is Deep State Radio.
Hello, I'm David Rothkopf. Welcome again to the podcast. As you know, every so often when a really important book comes out, we like to sit down with the author and talk about the book because we think it's one that you may want to get. In this particular case, I'm delighted to say that the author we are sitting down with is our friend Max Boot, columnist for the Washington Post, of the Council on Foreign Relations, previously a best-selling author. How are you today, Max?
I'm good. Just limbering up my vocal cords for the book launch. Always a trial of strength.
Well, we won't test you too hard here, I hope. But the book is called Reagan: His Life and Legacy. I have a copy sitting here on my desk, and it is a masterpiece. It is one of those books which deals with an exceptionally important subject that has been covered by many, many authors before. And yet somehow in the time, since, this book has come out, there seems to be an almost instant consensus that you've come up with a definitive biography of Ronald Reagan, which must be gratifying to you since I think you started working on this 11 years ago,
Yeah.
but is very unusual. Now, I'm going to attribute a chunk of it to the fact that you are brilliant and a great writer. But I have to say, I wonder to what extent one of the big advantages your book has is that we couldn't fully understand Reagan until now. And that many of the other books, which haven't seen some of the political fallout of the Reagan era play out as we have during the Trump era, you couldn't see the whole picture, and you've now timed this beautifully. Anyway, do you think that's a factor here?
Oh, absolutely. I think you're dead right. In fact, I even write in the book that it wasn't until the 1980s, Reagan's presidency, that we got a fuller sense of the Eisenhower presidency, which was 30 years earlier. And it usually takes like 30, 40 years after some president leaves office to really get an appreciation of who they were, what they achieved, and what they failed to achieve. And, I think I certainly have the advantage of historical hindsight now and historical perspective that was denied to earlier chroniclers. And I think a lot of things about the Reagan presidency look quite different today than they did at the time or even immediately after. I mean, just to give you one example, think about what it is that Democrats were attacking Ronald Reagan for primarily in the 1980s. The big attack was over the budget deficit, which was sky high, record setting at the time. But in hindsight, seems pretty puny because we've blown the roof off of our budget deficits in subsequent decades, and yet the country has survived. So the fact that we had these big budget deficits under Reagan, while certainly a failure for Reagan, who claimed he was going to balance the budget, it doesn't loom quite so large historically. But conversely, what's striking is that there were almost no Democratic attacks on Reagan in the 1980s for his shameful neglect of the AIDS pandemic. I mean, he didn't even talk about this horrible disease until 1987, even though tens of thousands of Americans were dying. And again, this was not an issue that Mondale or other Democrats were hitting him over the head with in the 1980s. But in hindsight, it looks shameful and inexcusable. And these are things that you only really understand with the passage of time.
Yeah, I agree with everything you just said, although I think we are, frankly, not even fully appreciating Eisenhower today. I think the more perspective we have on Dwight Eisenhower, the better his presidency looks. But
he was a giant for sure. Yeah.
He certainly was. But having said that, I think the other factor that plays into this, again, setting aside the timing and also your skills and gifts as a writer, is your own personal journey. Because you started out as, I don't want to minimize it by using the vernacular term, but kind of Reagan fanboy.
Absolutely.
Thought that this
I
guy
own it.
was, well, I understand. And over time, as you became aware of changes that took place in the Republican Party, some of which were born in the Reagan era, you've changed your views. So all of a sudden, you're able to look at this with the twin perspectives of somebody who loved Ronald Reagan and of somebody who is skeptical. And that's important in an author. How do you think that colored this?
Oh, I mean, I think you're absolutely correct. I mean, I think the fact that I've left the Republican Party, I've become an independent. I think that's been, while it's been a wrenching process for me personally, and I've lost a lot of friends and so forth and so on over the last decade. I think it's been very good for me as a writer and a biographer because it does give me a distance to be able to look at Reagan, and I still, retain some of my boyhood affection for him, but I'm also able to see him much more objectively than I once could when I was, just you know, a Reagan fan growing up. I'm able to see, his that not only his achievements, which were very real, but also his failures and his shortcomings, which even though he's a very very different figure from Trump, you can still see the passage of time and how he got from one to the other. And I think there is some never Trump conservatives who want to paint Reagan and other earlier Republicans as being pure and innocent and angelic and saintly and utterly divorced from the Republican Party. And there's no question there's massive differences between the Reagan GOP and the Trump GOP, but there are nevertheless continuities and similarities that you can point to. And it's certainly nothing. When you look at the long sweep of history, nothing happens in a vacuum. There are reasons why you get from point A to point B, and there's reasons why the Republican Party has arrived at its current state. And Ronald Reagan and earlier Republicans certainly contributed to that evolution, even though they certainly didn't wind up where Trump has wound up today.
I think I was just talking to a friend of ours who's got a book coming out, and he was struggling yesterday with the subtitle for the book. I don't think people understand the degree of sweat and agony that goes into figuring out.
I'm terrible with subtitles. I'm good with titles, but I'm horrible with subtitles. And this one was actually suggested by my editor.
Well, I got to tell you something. You should send your editor a nice note or a gift, because the subtitle for this book is perfect. His life and legend
Right.
captures the fact that since Reagan lived, something has evolved that is not a memory, but is something distorted to suit certain political purposes, and it is in fact a legend. And so, it's a very subtle way of saying you have to look at him and try to pierce through that legend. And I think one of the things that's great about the book is how much time you spend in the period before he entered politics, before he entered the White House, and you see what a conflicted, kind of non-legendary figure he was. I mean, from struggles in his family to a not super successful career in Hollywood, towards being batted around like a ping pong ball from different political perspectives. This was a guy kind of in search of himself for much of his life, maybe till he met his second wife, Nancy, maybe till he gave a speech at the 1964 convention in which it was clear, he sort of hit the zeitgeist in a particular way with a particular part of the party. Talk to me a little bit about how you view this evolution from a guy trying to fit in to a guy being at the center of America. I don't mean ideological center, but the center stage in American politics.
Well, this is one of the many mysteries that are hiding regarding Reagan, kind of hiding in plain sight, because he he had this amazing evolution from being this very ardent New Deal Democrat, huge fan of FDR as a young man in the 1930s, and that basically remained the case up until the mid to late 1940s. But by 1960, he emerges as what one newspaper of the time described as a right-wing oracle. He becomes very far to the right. So, what was it that moved Reagan from left to right in American politics? And the account that he always gave doesn't make any sense, because he always said, I didn't desert my party deserted me. Now that may make sense on the surface if he had become a Democrat around like 1972, and he could say like, "Oh, it was George McGovern, it was those hippies that made me a Democrat." But that's not when he became a Democrat. That's not when he became a Republican. Rather, he became a Republican in the 1950s, when the Democratic Party was actually quite conservative, led by Sam Rayburn and Lyndon Johnson. In 1960, John F. Kennedy ran to Richard Nixon's right on foreign policy. So his explanation just does not add up. You have to look elsewhere. How did Reagan become this conservative Republican? And I think it starts during World War II. And as a highly paid movie actor, he was very unhappy about paying like 90% tax rates on his income. But it really picks up steam in the late 40s, when he became at the center of these political fights in Hollywood. And he became convinced that there was a communist plot to take over Hollywood, which I argue was largely imaginary, but he was very convinced that it existed. And he became complicit on the Hollywood blacklist, and trying to, root out so-called Reds in Hollywood. And then it really gained pace in the 1950s, when, after the failure of his movie career, he got a second wind as a spokesman for General Electric and host of its General Electric Theater. He was, the first host of a nationally televised show to become president. But one of the things that went with being a GE spokesman was imbibing the GE worldview. And GE in the 1950s was a very conservative company whose outlook was likened by one of its executives to that of the John Birch Society. From their perspective, they thought that, proselytizing for right-wing ideology was an inoculation against unions and strikes, which would hurt their bottom line. And Reagan was always a very diligent employee, very eager to please his bosses. And so on these long cross-country train rides that he would take in the 50s from LA to New York to speak on behalf of GE, because he was afraid of flying in those days, he had a lot of time to read all this right-wing literature, a lot of it very conspiratorial and far to the right, that GE was forcing down the throats of its executives. And he came to believe it, and then came to repeat it in the speeches that he was giving on behalf of GE. So that was really the process of his ideological transformation. It wasn't that the Democratic Party changed. It really didn't. It was Ronald Reagan changed and went, very far to the right by the early 60s.
Yeah, naturally, one of the things that you address, and that, one can't help but look at things but through the lens of our moment, is that there's a tendency to sort of say, well, how does Reagan compare to Trump? How does Reagan tie to Trump? How does Reagan set the stage for Trump? And, you talk about a variety of things in the context of the book. Reagan had a TV show. Reagan, comes from the showbiz side of the equation. Reagan, had kind of a populist flair that is akin to Trump's populist flair. Reagan was not super into the business of governing. Trump's not super into the business of governing. But one thing that strikes me as quite different, and that is that Reagan, as you just described, seemed to be searching for ideological direction throughout his life. I think he made a lot of wrong choices. I'm not super impressed with the intellectual quality of his reasoning in arriving at the choices. But at least he sought a grounding. He sought something to believe in. Whereas I don't believe Trump believes in anything. I believe Trump's all about Trump and is all about, his personal well-being, and is super transactional with, all of his political doings. But how first of all, do you think that's right? And secondly, how when we think of Reagan as an ideological figure, how deep does that go? Because just to sort of bump it into the next question as well, one of the things you write about is that once he becomes the president, he's pretty pragmatic, and he sort of takes a step away from the ideology.
Yeah, that's actually kind of the central paradox of Ronald Reagan is that he was both intensely ideological and also very pragmatic. And in both ways, he really differs from Trump, I think, as you very astutely pointed out, because, with Trump, there is kind of a sense that it's all about him. It's all about, stroking his ego. Whereas Reagan, I mean, like anybody else who becomes president, he certainly had an ego, but it was much more firmly in check than it is with Trump. And and Reagan genuinely believed in a lot of this ideology, and he read a lot, which Trump certainly does not do. And I mean, a lot of the stuff that Reagan read was kind of crazy and not factually grounded, but he read and he convinced himself that it was true. And he moved, pretty far to the right by the early to mid 1960s. He was warning that Medicare and Medicaid was going to lead to the destruction of freedom in America, that Democrats were taking America down the road towards communism. He opposed civil rights legislation. So, he sounded a lot like a John Birch Society type right-wing extremist. But, people who thought that was the case were in for a big shock when he became governor of California and elected in 1966 and then elected president of the United States in 1980, because in both jobs, he actually showed a huge pragmatic streak. I mean, his very first bill that he signed as governor of California was the biggest tax increase and spending increase in California state history to close a budget deficit. And he subsequently signed the most liberal abortion law in the country and a very tough gun control bill. And, he cut deals with Democrats in Sacramento and later with Democrats in Washington. He worked with Tip O'Neill. In 1986, he signed an immigration bill that provided a path to citizenship for millions of undocumented immigrants. And then, of course, the most amazing transformation of all this for somebody like Ronald Reagan, who really began his political career as a red hunter in Hollywood, who was a staunch anti-communist, but he ended his political career working very closely with Mikhail Gorbachev, the world's #1 communist, to end the Cold War peacefully and reform the Soviet Union. So that's a transformation nobody could have anticipated. And so, I think what ultimately made Reagan a successful president is very different from what made him a successful politician. I think a lot of what made him a successful politician, at least initially, was that he was able to please the conservative base, and he did that very skillfully. But that by doing that, by winning the affection of conservatives, that also gave him huge running room to turn against conservative orthodoxy and to actually govern very pragmatically and much more effectively. And he had that kind of running room that presidents like George H.W. Bush or others who were viewed with suspicion on the right, they didn't have that leeway, and Reagan did, and he took full advantage of it to have a pretty successful 2 terms in office. And I think one of the anomalies with Trump is that he's just was never able to make that switch between campaigning and governing. There was no pragmatic centrist mode with Trump. I mean, he was as extremist in office as he was on the campaign trail.
Yeah, well, it seems like Trump is driven by his own worst impulses all the time. Somehow it seems like Reagan had managed to suppress or hide his worst impulses. And you talk about the fact that, he had a pretty lousy record, not just in terms of, let's say, racism, but in terms of the gay community and AIDS, and frankly didn't get along so great with his family. He was not, he comes across as this kind of affable guy, but, he was capable of being kind of a jerk, but we didn't see it. Do you attribute that to his skill, the skill of his handlers, the naivete of the press, all of the above?
It was really his skill in communicating. He was, the great communicator. It wasn't all phony or artificial. I mean, he really was a very affable, genial guy in public. But, people who were close to him, his aides, saw that that geniality, that amiability really hit kind of a glacial reserve, that he actually was not close to anybody with the part, except for Nancy. And as Jim Baker said to me, we always knew we were hired hands, that he could get rid of us tomorrow and not even notice that we were gone. So that was an essential coldness and distance to him, which I trace back to his childhood in Illinois, where with his alcoholic shoe salesman father losing one job after another, they kept moving from town to town, and so little Dutch Reagan didn't really get close to a lot of the other kids, and he was actually kind of a dreamer and a reader and would sit alone by himself in the attic, and that was basically him as an adult too. I mean, it's kind of a paradox, because he seemed so friendly and lovable to so many people, and yet Stu Spencer, who was his longtime political consultant, told me that Reagan would have made a pretty good hermit, because he didn't really need people. He was just happy by himself, watching Bonanza or Gunsmoke on TV, reading National Review, reading his books, doing whatever he wanted to do. He wasn't driven to socialize. Didn't really have a lot of close friends. So, that there was a huge gap between who he was truly inner core and the way he presented himself. But the way he presented himself was, and it wasn't, I don't think it was actively deceitful. It was just kind of, the skills that he learned growing up, in very, very effective. And that's what, it was really his amiability that made his often hardline message go down easy. I mean, this was something noticeable going back to the start of his career in 1964, when he was campaigning for Barry Goldwater. And a lot of people who heard both Goldwater and Reagan speak said, well, Reagan says the same things, but he says them in a much more pleasing and acceptable way. I mean, his personality was likened by journalists to soothing, warm bathwater, and that was an essential ingredient of his political success.
Yeah. I think another essential ingredient of his political success was that those hired hands included some very talented people, and that was not really the case in Trump's case, for example. But I the parts that I read with some interest, just because they resonated with things I've done. Because in past books that I've written, I ended up interviewing a lot of his national security team. And the whole gamut of people, including Meese and Schultz and Al Haig and Baker and Carlucci and Powell and so forth. And one of the things that came across to me was, this kind of double-edged, I don't know, that's not the right word, but this kind of double-sided quality of being detached. One was, particularly later in his presidency, they would say after 5 o'clock, they wouldn't even talk to him because he was kind of down for whatever the health reason was. But for most of the presidency, he left a lot of the work and the decisions to them. And to me, when I look at, for example, the U.S.-Russia relationship under Reagan, I see a lot of George Shultz, who was an extremely gifted diplomat and talented Secretary of State, and a willingness to sort of let him handle a lot of that, or perhaps that's just a consequence of being a little bit disconnected. How do you see that? Was this there was the Saturday Night Live bit of, sort of Reagan, being an idiot in public and then behind the scenes being a mastermind. How true was that in your book?
Well, the way I would put it is that I think he was a great leader because he inspired people and he communicated, but he was a very poor manager. He was very hands-off as a manager. And weirdly enough, even when he was president of the United States, he often acted as if he wasn't really in charge. And when on the rare occasions when he had to get rid of somebody, he would write in his diary, James Watt or Dick Allen or whoever was doing a great job, but then the media lynch mob got to them. And I'm thinking like, no, it wasn't the media lynch mob. You made the decision to hire and fire them. It was your choice. But then he acted like he had no choice, and he really deferred a lot to his advisors. And so when he had good advisors, he got good results. And Jim Baker in his first term was quite possibly the most effective White House chief of staff ever. And he was almost like a prime minister, frankly. And things ran, there was a lot of infighting in the White House, but things still ran pretty well. Then in the second term, that he made a calamitous decision when Jim Baker and Treasury Secretary Don Regan got together and said, "Hey, wouldn't it be fun to swap jobs?" And they basically presented this as a fait accompli to Reagan. And in a half an hour meeting, he said, "Oh, sure, go right ahead." And then Don Regan turned out to be a disastrous White House chief of staff, whose presence made possible the Iran-Contra affair, the worst scandal of the Reagan presidency. But then after Iran-Contra, Nancy Reagan convinced the president to fire Don Regan and then bring in Howard Baker to save the White House. And so things ran better towards the end of the second term when it was, Howard Baker and then Ken Duberstein as White House chief of staff, when you had replaced John Poindexter as national security advisor with first Frank Carlucci, then Colin Powell, then Carlucci goes to become Secretary of Defense. Schultz is Secretary of State. So by the end of the second term, they had a very cohesive team. And you're absolutely right. I mean, I talked to all those same people you talked to, and what they told me was, with Carlucci, Powell, Schultz, kind of the heavy hitters, they would get together every morning and basically make the decisions and say, like, let's decide among ourselves so we don't have to kick these things up to the president, because it's better if we don't. But all of that said, I will say this in favor of Reagan, which is that it wasn't like he only got advice in one direction. Throughout most of his presidency up until the end, there were bitter battles between kind of the doctrinaire conservatives and the more pragmatic faction, often represented in the cabinet by the battles between Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger and Secretary of State George Shultz. Schultz wanted to engage with the Soviet Union. Weinberger thought it was all a commie plot, and we just had to keep raising defense spending indefinitely. And it was ultimately Ronald Reagan's choice, with a little nudge from Nancy and Mike Deaver and others, to basically trust George Shultz over Cap Weinberg. And I think that was greatly aided by the fact that when Reagan finally met Gorbachev at Geneva in 1985, he established a personal rapport with him and decided this was a guy I can actually do business with. And at that point, Weinberger and the hardliners began to be sidelined, and Reagan started working very actively with Gorbachev, which turned out to be a phenomenally successful policy. That's what really accounted for the end of the Cold War. It wasn't Reagan's defense buildup. It wasn't his so-called efforts to bring down the evil empire, which didn't really exist. It was really his policy of cooperating with Gorbachev. And obviously a lot of that driven by Powell, by Schultz and others. But at the end of the day, Reagan had to be on board, and he was.
Yeah, although the whole thing was less successful than it might have been, in part because Reagan didn't understand some things, notably Star Wars, and which he believed in, and was not a thing. But
his two big passions were tax cuts and Star Wars, and in both cases, he was impervious to empirical evidence. He just had faith that it would work.
Yeah. So I could go on and on. This, first of all, I can always go on and on to talk to you. And secondly, this is a very extensive, fantastic, brilliant book, but it really covers a lot. So, but what I want to end with a question about what is the thing that I think a lot of readers will come to this, which is, to what extent is Ronald Reagan the father of Donald Trump? And I write columns and I go and talk about this stuff. And there are a few things that I find I regularly go back to and say, this problem started then, right? One of them is what I call the original big lie, which is government is the problem, which is a thing that Reagan managed to sell. There are little behind the scenes things, among the Reagan aides you didn't mention, who is particularly odious in my book, is the former CIA director Casey, who became involved in a business that sort of got Rupert Murdoch in place in the United States and ultimately gave us the end of the fairness doctrine, ultimately gave us Fox News and Trump and so forth. And I think that a lot traces back to the Reagan era. I think the shift in American politics to television personality presidents is another thing that I sort of trace back to that era. And I could go on, but I didn't write the book. You did. So my question is, what are the seeds of our current problems that you think are most directly traceable to Reagan and that era?
Well, big picture, I think it kind of goes back even before Reagan. It really goes back to Goldwater in '64 when you had the conservative takeover of the Republican Party. And remember, in '64, most Republicans in Congress voted in favor of civil rights legislation, but Barry Goldwater was opposed to it, and so was Ronald Reagan. And that was really when the Republican Party started moving very far to the right. And what's happened is, I think, over the course of the decades, each generation of Republicans is further to the right than the previous generation, such that Reagan was well to the right of Nixon and Ford, and Trump, in turn, is well to the right of Reagan. But I think you can see how each generation keeps moving the party to the right, and you can see, a lot of the continuities you mentioned between Reagan and Trump, as well as huge differences. I mean, I think there's no question that, if Reagan were alive today, he would be denounced as a rhino, like so many other previous Republicans have been, because he's so at odds with the MAGA Republican Party. But you can also see how his presidency helped to get us here. And I think kind of the bottom line is that the irony really is that, in 1980, when Reagan won, Reaganism was really taking the Republican Party and the country to the right. Today, if Reaganism were to prevail within the Republican Party, it would be taking the party to the left. It would be taking the party back in a more centrist direction. So that's how far to the right we've gone.
Well, that's, a good place to end, not only because it's true, but also because it goes back to the earlier point about the legend. Legends get abused by people to serve their own interests. And ultimately, the Ronald Reagan, who the airport is named after, is not really the Ronald Reagan who was president. The Ronald Reagan that Mike Johnson refers to lovingly in the Congress wasn't really Ronald Reagan. In the same way that John F. Kennedy that we talk about today had almost nothing to do with the real John F. Kennedy. Right. And because of that, but because he is such a seminal figure, it is essential to be able to go sit down and understand the truth. And the way to do that is this book by Max, Reagan, His Life and Legend. It is the best book on this most important subject, right in a moment where we really need to understand it, both because of what it means for Trump, but also, frankly, I think this book's going to be a lot more important, Max, at 4:00 in the morning on November 6th, because Donald Trump's going to lose, I hope. And the Republican Party is going to go, now what? Now what? Now, where do we go? What has worked for us in the past? And the first place they're going to go and look is Reagan, because that was the pillar of the party. And they need to understand what was true about it and what wasn't. And so I only see this book being more relevant. I congratulate you. Magnificent work of scholarship, magnificent work of literary achievement, magnificent work of history, and all 11 years paid off big time. So congratulations.
Thank you very much, David. Truly, truly a pleasure and an honor to be on with you and to hear your kind words. That truly means a lot to me. Thank you.
Thank you. And folks, sometimes I say go get the book. This case, I really mean it. Go get the book. You will not regret it. And, the next time we have an important book, we'll be back with it. And every day we've got so many podcasts for you. So come back for them. But until then, thank you, Max. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.